Hello everyone, my name is Blister and I'm glad to have you back because today we're going to talk about something I've been wanting to talk about for a long time, the most iconic weapons in classic WoW. Leveling up was half of the game in classic, or at least for me it was, until I actually got to cap and started raiding, and then I realized how much more there was to this game. That endgame content also brought myself and many other people some weapons that they will never forget. I can remember being a lowly level 40 hunter and running around Ironforge inspecting everyone and looking at their awesome weapons. Today, I'm going to give you my top 10 most iconic weapons from Classic. Don't fret though, I did use the general populace to help me decide on what weapons would crack the top 10. Our first weapon at number 10 are Arlocke's Grasp and Thakal's Grasp. Back in Classic, Blizzard really liked the idea of sets. Obviously we had the armor sets with tier 0, 0.5, 1, 2, and even 3, but we also had armor sets from dungeons while leveling up, and even some small random sets in other places. These two items were one of those random sets, yet it was a really cool weapon set. While there's nothing particularly special in terms of how these weapons were achieved, they were really iconic because of how they procced. Once you get these weapons to proc, while you're using both of them, you would transform into this man-tiger beast for 12 seconds and you gain 300 attack power. The weapons by themselves weren't spectacular, but when you got both weapons and were able to proc them, the weapons actually turned out to be pretty good weapons considering that they dropped from Zul'Gurub. Despite the fact that Thakal's Grasp had agility on it, some DPS warriors would even go after this set because of the crazy proc bonus. Whenever I see a top weapons list in Classic, I tend to see this weapon left out quite a bit. My best guess as to why that is because a lot of people haven't seen them in action, which is really a shame because it's really cool to actually see when this weapon procs. Our number 9 weapon is Perdition's Blade. Similar to our number 10 spot, Perdition's Blade was just a normal drop from the Fire Lord Ragnaros. This dagger was one of the best for a rogue back in the day, and it dropped from a boss that when compared to a lot of other raids was pretty easy to get, meaning that there were a lot of rogues running around with this weapon. This dagger was especially popular when it came to PvP. It was not uncommon for rogues to get into bidding wars for this dagger or even dump all of their DKP on it. It was that sought after. Just to give you an idea of how powerful this weapon was, I've heard of rogues swapping from sword spec to dagger spec just because they were able to get this weapon. Blizzard felt that this weapon was iconic enough to even make the transition from World of Warcraft to Hearthstone, where it serves as a rogue-only weapon card. The last thing I want to say about this weapon is just look at it. It's an amazing model. Even for being over 10 years old, this still holds up with models that are being released today. Our number 8 spot is Ashcandy Great Sword of the Brotherhood. Ashcandy is another sword that doesn't have any special requirements for obtaining. Ashcandy is looted from Nefarian, who's the last boss in Blackwing Lair. Personally, I don't find it to be the most aesthetically pleasing weapon, but that is not why it's on this list. The lore behind this weapon is all we need for why this weapon makes the list. The flavor text on the item says, the initials AL are etched on the hilt. AL stands for Anduin Lothar. Anduin Lothar was a knight champion and the supreme commander for the Alliance throughout the years. He is widely considered to be one of the greatest warriors in all of human history. And yes, even Anduin Wrynn, who's the current king of the Alliance, was named after him. The brotherhood that the sword references is the Brotherhood of the Horse, or Knights of Stormwind. Anduin Lothar was killed in combat during the Second World War at the base of Blackrock Mountain, which is how Nefarian would have most likely been able to obtain this weapon. Based on what lore we know about this weapon, it does look a little different than what we would expect. The weapon itself has dragons in the hilt of the design. While Anduin would have been using it, it would have had lions in place of the dragons on it. It's widely believed that Nefarian actually corrupted the weapon, and that's why it has the dragons instead of the lions. However, in my researching, I could not find anything that 100% confirmed that. Our number 7 weapon is Sulfurous, Hand of Ragnaros. This is the first of our legendary weapons on this list. Obviously, this is a very iconic weapon back in the day. Not only is it an actual legendary weapon, but it is also supposed to be the same weapon that Ragnaros himself used. The reason this legendary is low compared to other legendaries was because of how this weapon was acquired. To acquire this item, it just simply was pretty much just a boss drop like the previous other 3 items. There are 2 parts to obtaining this weapon. The first one is to acquire the Eye of Sulfurous, which is a legendary drop from Ragnaros. Once you had that, you can combine it with the Sulfuron Hammer. The Sulfuron Hammer was itself not a drop. The hammer was actually crafted by a blacksmith. The plans for the weapon were purchased by using a Sulfuron ingot that were dropped by Golmag incinerators in Molten Core. Then, once you had the recipe itself was actually pretty expensive. You needed 8 of the Sulfuron ingots, 20 Dark Iron bars, 50 Arcanite bars, 25 Essence of Fire, 10 Blood of the Mountain, 10 Lava Core, and 10 Fiery Core. It was by no means a simple task to obtain all of those items for the mace, but compared to other legendaries, you could argue that it was just a gold sink rather than something hard to get. Our number 6 item is Atiash Great Staff of the Guardian. The main reason for this being on our list is because it is another legendary weapon from Classic, but it is also the only legendary quality weapon for casters in Classic WoW, making it pretty iconic for any caster. Furthermore, it was also the first class specific legendary. There were mage, warlock, priest, and druid variations of the weapon, but they were all class specific. The weapon is also famous because of who wielded it before the player did. Medivh had it, and then later on in the lore it was handed down to Khadgar. To obtain this weapon, you first must collect 40 splinters of Atiash from the random drops off of bosses within Naxxramas. From there, you would receive a quest to go and kill Quel'Serrar, who's the last boss of Naxxramas, and Cthulhu, the last boss from the Temple of Ahn'Qiraj, or AQ40. The final piece requires the player to cleanse the staff itself at Stratholme, again requiring a group in order to do so. This weapon was indeed pretty difficult to get, but the majority of the actual challenge was because it wasn't something you could do on your own. Killing Quel'Serrar and Cthulhu were things you had to do with your guild, let alone get the 40 shards while you're killing bosses in Naxxramas. While getting the weapon is not simple, I would argue that the next weapons on our list are more difficult than this one. That brings us to our 4th and 5th slot, because I believe they are equal on this list, Benediction and Rhok'delar Longbow of the Ancient Keepers. Both of these weapons were acquired in a very similar form. First, you have to obtain an item from a raid boss. Then you go and do some farming, and then you get an epic quest that you have to accomplish by yourself. The Benediction quest had you in the Plague Lands helping peasants escape from the undead. You did this by healing and dispelling them. The quest would be complete once 50 peasants had been rescued. However, if 15 were killed, it would be game over. Like all quests, you could abandon or restart this quest, but there was a 2-hour wait limit between attempts. This was widely regarded as one of the hardest challenges for any priest in Classic. Not only would you be getting a fantastic weapon out of it, but you would also be getting some pretty good bragging rights. The same could be said for Rhok'delar. For the Hunter quest, you had to kite and kill 4 boss level demons. Like with the Priest's quest, you were not allowed any outside help to complete this quest. Even the smallest heal would reset the pull. I mained a Hunter back in Classic, and I had the bragging rights of having this weapon. If you have this, it meant that you knew what you were doing. You could DPS hard, kite effectively, and even manage your aggro. These challenges were so hard that it was not uncommon for priests and hunters to have the items to attempt this, but never actually complete the quests until later after the launch of BC, because the quests were just that hard. Our number 3 weapon is Quel'Serrar. Aside from another weapon higher up on our list, this weapon is the most iconic tanking weapon, especially when I look back and personally think about my most iconic weapons. This was actually a pretty unique quest to get this item. It started off in Dire Maul by looking through dusty tomes or a boss drop. Ultimately, The only real requirement to get this item is some tricky work with a successful Onyxia kill. What actually happens is you get an item, and then you have to go into Onyxia and get a successful kill. You place the sword on the ground in front of Onyxia, and when she breathes fire onto the sword, she heats it up. Once she's done that, you can finish the encounter and kill Onyxia, and then once you do that, you can go and pick up your item, and then you can finish your quest. If your raid doesn't actually successfully kill Onyxia, you have to be careful. Dropping the weapon in front of her is a one-use only item. That being said, if your guild does fail, you can abandon the quest and pick it back up at the Elven Library in Dire Maul. You don't need to find the book again. Something else that's kind of interesting with this weapon is it seems to have some reference to Quel'Serrar, which is another weapon that belonged to the mighty Anduin Lothar. There has been some speculation over the years whether or not these are actually the same weapons. Quel'Serrar is directly translated as High Blade, and Quel'Serrar in-game is also called the High Blade. Aside from that, the hilt on both weapons actually look very similar. It is even speculated that Quel'Serrar is the original Darnassian word for the High Blade, since the quest from the weapon originates in Dire Maul, which is an old Night Elf city. Our number 2 weapon is the Corrupted Ashbringer. The Corrupted Ashbringer was not necessarily something that you would have seen a lot in classic WoW. There were other two-handed weapons that were more sought after because of their slower speed, and the Corrupted Ashbringer drops off the 4 Horsemen boss, which is arguably one of the most challenging bosses just because of how many highly geared tanks they've required. All of that being said, everyone knows this weapon. It is the corrupted version of the famous Ashbringer. The Ashbringer was Alexandros Mograin's weapon. Mograin was betrayed by his son Renault, who killed him with this weapon, and ultimately it was him who transformed it into the Corrupted Ashbringer. Until the events of Wrath of the Lich King, the blade remained corrupted until Darian Mograin, Alexandros' son, betrayed the Lich King and cleansed the blade. Upon doing so, he handed the weapon down to Tyrion Fordring. All in all, this weapon is so iconic because of all the lore built into this weapon. Some of that lore didn't happen until after the events of Classic. However, that being said, the Corrupted Ashbringer was still a pretty iconic weapon. Most famously, it was known for what it was before it got corrupted. It was a mighty weapon against the armies of the undead. The name Ashbringer actually comes from its first wielder, Alexandros, who was an extremely powerful paladin that was known as the Ashbringer for his works against the undead. And our number 1 weapon, if you haven't guessed it by now, is Thunderfury, Blessed Blade of the Windseeker. This is an obvious number 1 choice. I mean, I didn't really want to make it that, but it's by far the most iconic weapon in the history of the game. Despite Blizzard trying to make this a rogue weapon by putting agility on it, the chain lightning effect that occurs on hit makes it a very desirable weapon for tanks as well. Even Fury warriors who are running 2 one-handed weapons would seek this out. The weapon itself was actually another weapon controlled by another elemental, similar to the other legendary that you get from Molten Core. Thunderfury was the weapon that Thunderran, the Prince of Air, wielded. Ragnaros attempted to take the power from Thunderran, but was unable to completely absorb his powers. What Ragnaros did was take the remaining power and put it into 2 bindings. Ragnaros distributed those 2 bindings to his 2 lieutenants, Baron Geddon and Gar. The 2 bindings are drops from both of those bosses in Molten Core. Combining them gives you the bindings of the Windseeker, which is how you start the quest line to obtain Thunderfury. Once you start the quest, you will need to kill Ragnaros, and from there you must collect 10 enchanted Elementium bars, which were insanely pricey in Classic. Once you got all the materials, you and your raid will need to go to Sulfurous. Why your raid? Because it's time to summon Thunderran himself. Once you do, you have to defeat Thunderran. And in doing so, it's pretty much just a simple turn-in from there to obtain the weapon. Compared to others on this list, the lore is not nearly as rich as, say, Ash Candy or the Corrupted Ashbringer, but there is no doubt that Thunderfury is still the most iconic weapon in the game. And that's it. Those are our 10 most iconic weapons for Classic WoW. There are a lot of weapons to choose from, and it certainly was not easy to whittle it down to just 10. Classic was full of unique and iconic weapons that still hold up to today's standards. I want to know from you guys down in the comments, what weapons were most iconic for you? I want to see something really out there that I missed entirely. As always guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Hey, it's Radit here. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe as well. It really helps out the channel. We put out multiple new videos each week and we appreciate all of your support. Thanks for watching everyone, and cheers.